There are hundreds, maybe even thousands, of videos on YouTube that cover the do's and don'ts of watercolor painting. This tutorial is not going to cover a lot of that, so go watch a few of those before you return to this video. This tutorial is strictly going to follow my step-by-step process for doing my watercolor portraits. Many artists differ in their style and their process, so this is my personal method. I hope what you can take away from this video are bits and pieces that you like, and you can maybe learn a thing or two on the different ways that one can paint with watercolor. This is pretty much everything that I use to do my watercolor paintings. I will have a complete list down in the description for this video, but this is a general idea of what it looks like. There are a few other things that I don't show here. I use a Masonite board. You don't need to use a Masonite board specifically, but any sort of flat board that you can tape your paper down to, because watercolor paper tends to ripple and bend as you apply paint to it. So you want to stick it down with any sort of tape that isn't going to tear the paper. I specifically use masking tape because it holds, but it doesn't really rip the paper when you peel it off at the end. For my paper, I use cold-pressed watercolor paper, and I'll put the brand I use down in the description below. I don't really want to get into the difference between cold-pressed and hot-pressed in this video. I would just suggest to get a feel for both of them and see which one you personally like better. I personally find that I like cold-pressed better. I like the texture that it tends to have when I paint. With watercolor paints, they usually come in two different forms. You can get the hardened pans or the individual tubes, which are more in a liquid state. I personally like to work with the tubes, but either one is fine because the tubes do harden and are also reusable just like the pans are. This is my typical watercolor portrait palette. I don't necessarily use every color here in every single portrait, but I usually have them hardened in this palette for future use because the paint can be reused. You can use whatever colors you want. This is just my personal palette that I have developed through my use of watercolors. And like with the paper, I will put the brands of all of my paint that I use down below in the description. I like to start my watercolor portraits with a base drawing in pencil. I usually start this sketch and work out the features and everything on a scrap piece of paper, something of cheaper quality, so not using my good paper. And I make sure that everything's placed correctly, there's a real likeness to the person I'm trying to paint, and once I'm happy with that, then I go ahead and trace it onto my good sheet of watercolor paper. I do this so that I can start painting with a nice clean surface. When I sketch, I tend to press really hard with a pencil, and that creates divots in the page and makes it really hard for graphite to be erased. With watercolor, once you start laying down the first few layers of paint, you can't erase the graphite underneath those layers. And when I paint, I much prefer not to have pencil lines. Some artists do, some artists don't. When I'm doing realistic portraits, I don't like the lines, so I make sure to trace really lightly so that I can erase later. And here you can see me doing just that. I take my kneaded eraser and I dab at the page. I don't press too hard, just enough that it starts to lift the graphite off of the paper. And I'm making sure the lines are really, really light. They're still there. I don't know how well they show up on camera, but I can still see them, and that's the important part. I just want them barely visible so that I can still use them as guidelines, but they won't show up as much under layers and layers of paint. Another thing this method of tracing onto the fresh sheet of paper helps is that when you're sketching, you erase a lot. And every time you erase, it strips away at the paper, and it ends up creating this fibrous sort of spot that can really cause problems later on when you're painting. So I much prefer to have a nice clean surface where I'm not going to be furiously erasing at mistakes I've made. I personally like starting with the skin tones when I'm painting faces. That's my personal preference. You don't have to. But the important thing to remember is whatever you're starting with, dab at the lines that are going to potentially be touched by paint, because you won't be able to lighten them later. So here I've made sure to lighten all the lines surrounding the face, anything that I think is going to be touched by paint in the beginning, because I won't be able to fix it later on if I forget something. I'm going to start out with warning you that I will probably mispronounce paint names. I really suck at that, but I don't really have the energy to be going and searching up the correct pronunciation, so please bear with me. To start out my skin tone, I like to put down a base layer. I mix pale orange number 1 and a little bit of Naples yellow with a whole lot of water. I want a very transparent wash, and I like to test it on my scrap sheet of paper as needed. And so I cover the entire face, everything that is skin, avoiding the eyes and the lips. While that first base layer is drying, I mix up 4 little sections of my palette. I strengthen my first one with pale orange number 1 and a little bit of Naples yellow. I create a second one with Naples yellow and a little bit of pale orange, so it's a little more on the yellow side. My third one is pale orange number 1, Naples yellow, and a little bit of permanent rose, so it's a little pinkier. And my fourth one is pale orange number 1, Naples yellow, yellow ochre light, and a little bit of yellow ochre. It's a little more dark. So these 4 tones As I begin to layer down paint, my pencil guidelines become harder to see. So to ensure that I have the eyes in the right place or the nose still looks the right shape, I like to line those features and strengthen the pencil guidelines with paint. I take a little bit of pale orange number 1, some raw umber, and a little bit of burnt umber to create a brown color, and I add lots of water so that it's very, very transparent. And I line those features in order to make sure that they don't get lost as I'm laying in the skin tone. Once I have my lines in place, I will continue layering with those first 4 mixtures, going back and forth, and just really strengthening the color, different forms. I like to choose photos with half the face or part of the face in shadow to really create a dynamic image, and to really strengthen the forms of the face and create some 3-dimensionality. So I focus a lot on the sides of the nose, the apples of the cheeks, under the chin, under the nose, the jaw, and the neck. And I just keep on layering and layering and layering until it starts to create form. I introduce more colors as I layer. Eventually, I'll start to introduce pinks by using permanent rose, carmine red, a little pale orange, and a little permanent red light. And with it, I will focus on the areas from the image that have more pink tones, and the specific image that includes around the eyes, parts of the ears, around the nose, and around the chin and lips. And from there, I will continue layering using the colors I have already mixed. I will oftentimes add more paint to these colors in order to make them more pigmented as opposed to transparent, so that I can strengthen the shadows and strengthen the other tones of the face. As I work, I go back and forth between layering the tones on the face and adding more detail to the specific facial features. I will eventually draw on the eyebrows and add more detail to the eyes. I use a mixture of burnt umber, Van Dyke brown, and a little bit of ivory black. And I will begin with a more transparent tone and gradually add more pigment to that color mixture in order to add more detail and make them more distinct on the face. My favorite part to work on with human faces are definitely the eyes. The way I work is I completely disregard the white highlights seen oftentimes in photographs of people's eyes, because I will later on add them in with a white gel pen. So for now, I completely ignore them and act as if it's one solid eye with no highlight in them whatsoever. Chenyul's eyes are brown, but in this particular photograph, I saw hints of blue in them, whether from the stage lights or his surrounding environment, and so I used a bluer tone using ultramarine blue, Prussian blue, and a little bit of ivory black. And as I worked on his eyes, it ended up getting quite dark, so I used a little bit of water, no paint, just water on my brush, and I lifted some of the pigment around the outer edge of his iris in order to be able to add a little more detail into his eyes. Now, human eyes have these little lines coming from the pupil to the outer edge of the iris. They're kind of like the spokes on a wheel for a bicycle, and I really enjoy adding that little bit of realism to it, so I made sure to include hints of that within his eyes. And here I am just continuing on with layering those first 4 color mixtures onto the face. For the lips, I begin with a light wash of permanent rose, and from there I start to add darker tones and different mixtures of permanent rose, carmine, and permanent red light to create these thin lines that you see on lips, and in order to show some form. Teeth are quite tricky, and usually I like to avoid open mouth smiles, but here I've sort of challenged myself. The advice I can give for painting teeth with watercolor is to use very, very transparent washes and to not fully outline the teeth, because then it'll start looking quite scary in the image. I just very carefully layer on little by little until I'm happy with the end product. For the shadows of the lips, I introduce browns into the mixture with the pinks and the reds. I like to add burnt sienna, raw umber, and sometimes a little bit of Van Dyke brown and burnt umber, just to darken them up and to really emphasize the shadowed parts of the lips. Just really pay attention to the source material, your reference image, when painting the lips. Pay attention to where there's highlight and when there are darker areas of the lips. And I do ignore the bright white highlights, the shininess to the lip, because I do add those in later with a gel pen. Once I have the features down pat, then I have a more general image of the face, and I like to begin adding either darker shadows to the face. I will then introduce more burnt umber and Van Dyke brown and even a little bit of ivory black into my layers and mixtures in order to gradually create a gradient shadow that stretches along the cheeks in this case and the ear and neck. So next I like to work on the hair. I take my kneaded eraser and I lighten the outline, just as I did with the face, and I add a light brown wash to the entire area of hair. I completely ignore the very bright lights within the hair because, like I said, with the eyes and the lips, I will add those at a later time with a white gel pen. After that base layer dries, I begin to add slightly less transparent washes of brown and slowly map out the different sections of the hair. So I add the darker layers to the more darker areas, the shadow areas of the hair. As I layer on darker and darker washes, if I find that the highlighted part is much too white, I also add washes over top of it to sort of bring the two parts more together. And as I work, I get smaller and smaller paintbrushes in there to draw in the individual hairs and begin to give the hair a little more texture and realism. I typically work on the clothing last for my portraits, and I use a style that includes a lot of drips and splatters. So for Chen Yul here, his clothing is navy, so I use different mixtures of ultramarine, phthalo blue, Prussian blue, with a little bit of ivory black, and even some purple. And I create very, very big batches of them so that there's a lot of water and different varying degrees of pigment in there in order to create these drips. First, I leave my board flat down and I sort of add in the paint and get the general form of the outfit before I lift the board up onto an angle and begin to drip down the page. This part was actually kind of difficult to film, but I think I managed the general idea. It's just a lot of practice and patience and being very careful not to add too much paint and water, but also add enough so that it drips, and tapping the board, shaking the board, and doing whatever you can to drip. After that, I let it dry, and I add in later on more dark areas and sort of sharpen up the form of clothes. But even after that, I keep it rather loose and kind of messy. It's just a style that I like to go with. And then I take my bigger paintbrushes and splatter on the page, being very, very careful not to get any on the face. This part is very much up to you and what you feel is enough, what you feel looks good. Just adding them as you wish. It's very, very messy and organic, and I really love doing it. This is probably one of my favorite parts of painting this. I wait for the entire painting to dry before I introduce the gel pen so that my hand doesn't accidentally lift wet paint and smear it across the page, which I have done in the past. So I take my gel pen and I just look at my reference image and I mark down where the highlight is in the eyes, on the lips, different parts of the hair. There's wherever highlights are. And I also personally like to add white dots just around the face, just as a sort of stylistic touch that I just personally like to add myself. And there you have it, a portrait of Chen Yul done in my style. If you have any questions, feel free to comment down below. I'll try my best to answer them in text. Sometimes it's just easier to show it, so perhaps you will entice me to create another tutorial video. Until next time!